Words are only a portion of strategic communication. What are some of the other aspects?
As the book points out, there are really four broad aspects to strategic communications elements. It's words, it's symbols, it's images, but also deeds and action. And not every form of military action is necessarily strategic communication, but some of it can be. I thought it's very interesting to see the way, for example, in modern times, the use by different leaders in different situations of helicopters is made, both a positive and a negative difference. The British used them very effectively as a show of force in Sierra Leone. It worked for us and against us in Mogadishu, in Somalia. Obviously, helicopters were the means through which the brave people in Navy SEAL Team 6 reached bin Laden. They were also integral to the plan for Eagle Claw to rescue the hostages in Iran in 1980. In fact, one of the interesting things that the book talks about, quoting Lieutenant General Chuck Pitts, who was there, and he would speak for himself and I would quote him, is that although he is very sympathetic to the decisions that were made, because those are the decisions that commanders on the ground had to make, but he also makes the case that there was an alternative view about whether or not they actually had enough helicopters to carry out the mission. He thinks that it could have been carried out with the helicopters that they had, and that they did not necessarily have to abort the mission. And I think that it's just interesting to see the way people make decisions, and all of these things make a difference in the images that you project, how action can affect behavior and attitudes towards you and your policies, and the effectiveness and the impact that your policies and actions can have.
Who do you think is a historically underrated strategic communicator?
Eisenhower. Eisenhower's view towards defeating the Soviets during the Cold War is a case study in presidential leadership and decision making. He had been very unhappy with the way that decision making had been made under Truman. He was unique in his background, having been a commander in war, having been president of a university, having been a chief of staff in the Army, and knowing the personalities and seeing government work firsthand. And he understood that for strategic communication, the most effective way to do that was to put it under the direct control of a hands-on president. And Eisenhower's public image of himself was that as sort of a grandfather who talked in sort of muddled tones. That was a very calculated image. When you look at some of the memos that Eisenhower wrote, you would think that you were in a postgraduate doctoral class at Harvard. He had a very incisive mind. He was extremely well read, a very smart man who had a very clear strategic sense of what he wanted to accomplish in defeating communism. And he took hands-on control of the national security apparatus to do that. The entire effort of his administration to defeat communism was a disciplined effort in strategic communication, and it's a case study that students and anyone interested in current history, I think, would enjoy learning more about. Eisenhower's image is now, I think, just now beginning to get a second look, but the fact of the matter is he was a very strong and very effective executive in foreign policy.
How would you rate the abilities of the candidates in the 2012 presidential race?
Good question. I mean, I suppose the answer will be it depends upon which one wins. Tomorrow night, as we tape this, is the first debate between the two. Romney proved to be a very effective debater in his last three debates of the Republican primaries. President Obama did very well against John McCain, who was also a good debater. They both did a good job in their debates. Interestingly enough, I don't think that President Obama is as naturally skilled a strategic communicator as a lot of people do. He reads speeches very well. His Jefferson-Jackson Day speech that he gave in 2008 is one of the great pieces of political oratory in recent times. But most of the speeches that he gives don't really have the kind of grounding that Churchill or Clinton or Newt Gingrich or other people that have been really great orators have had. And I think it's probably one of the reasons that he doesn't connect. I mean, you can agree or disagree with his policies, but this just addresses how good is he at strategic communication. I think that Joe Biden is a very effective strategic communicator. A lot of Republicans don't like him, but the fact of the matter is that he's a born politician, and he has a great common touch, and he's very effective at what he does. Gingrich is an extraordinarily talented strategic communicator, which is one of the reasons that he commands good press. Part of it is because he has a strong intellect, part of it is that he has a gift for language, and he has a good sense of timing to be able to command the attention of people at critical times. One of the interesting things about Sarah Palin, whether you like her or not, is that she's actually quite a gifted strategic communicator. When she said of Obamacare that it's going to create death panels, she probably did more damage politically to the cause of those who supported the Affordable Health Care Act than any of the other opponents did. John Kerry has been a very effective communicator sometimes and not at others. Curiously enough, during the 2004 election, he was not, although his greatest mistake, talking about first I voted for the $87 billion and then I voted against it, is a case study in what happens to a candidate who opens his mouth when he is tired. In the 2012 Democratic Convention, he gave one of the more eloquent and powerful speeches on behalf of Barack Obama, and of course he first commanded attention after he came home from Vietnam because he was a very eloquent speaker.
How does President Obama's wit compare to President Reagan's?
One of the things that's curious to me is that in his public pronouncements as a public official, he's not humorous or witty at all. But when you see him on something like Jay Leno and A Day with Letterman, there is a natural sense of humor that comes bubbling to the surface, and I think it's interesting that side of him is not something that seems to appear very often in his political life. I'm not quite sure why that is. And I think that from his point of view, it's unfortunate because I think that humor, wit, shows warmth and is important to your ability to connect with an audience.
Who would benefit from reading this book?
Anybody interested in very colorful figures of history and how they used communication in order to advance their ideas and their agendas. Strategic communication is the use of words and action, symbols and images in order to mold and shape attitudes, to influence behavior, to achieve desired ends or an end state. Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, that it rhymes, and I think that that's right. And it's very interesting when you compare how Julius Caesar and Napoleon thought about communication, compare them to how Winston Churchill, Teddy Roosevelt, Susan Anthony, Margaret Thatcher, President Mubarak, any number of figures both in ancient history and modern history have done this. And what this book does, using very vivid, colorful examples, is to try and bring this alive and to present a very clear understanding in a very entertaining way of a subject that I think is fascinating and that I think everybody would find interesting. It's interesting if you're a diplomat, if you're in intelligence, if you're in the military, but I think it's just as interesting if you're interested in history or contemporary events, or interested in colorful and interesting personalities.